Imagine holding a book in your hands. On the cover, there's this stark, almost jarring visual.
Oh, it completely stops you in your tracks.
Right. On the left side, you have the bright red background and the black swastika of the National Socialist Labor Party. And then right next to it, sharing the exact same cover, is the familiar red, white, and blue donkey of the American Democratic Party.
It's essentially a massive visual collision.
It is, yeah. It instantly makes you stop and ask, well, what on earth do these two institutions have in common?
And, the imagery is intentionally pulling you into a very specific, highly complex historical analysis. You're looking at a comparative timeline from the 1920s through 1945, focusing on how these two vastly different political entities responded to just, well, massive societal and economic upheaval.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are exploring this deeply provocative scholarly work based on the book Between Extremes, the intersecting histories of the National Socialist Labor Party and the Democratic Party. But before we take one single step further into this material, we really need to pause and make something very explicit.
Yes, absolutely. We must make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are not endorsing the viewpoints of this content, nor are we taking any political sides, left-wing or right-wing.
Exactly.
We are simply here to impartially report on the ideas and historical comparisons contained in the original source material.
Right. Our mission for this deep dive is to trace a chronological timeline of how two vastly different parties used populist rhetoric during times of massive economic crisis to redefine national identity. We'll look at how mass media normalized these ideologies, how differing social policies impacted minority and marginalized communities, and most importantly, what actionable lessons modern voters and university students can extract about institutional failures and democratic stability.
And to really understand how radical rhetoric takes root, we have to start in the crucible of crisis. We really have to go back to the 1920s and 30s.
Because you can't understand the messaging without understanding the sheer economic desperation of the families actually hearing it.
Exactly. We have to examine the specific economic crises that fuel the rise of each party's ideology.
So let's bridge the empathy gap for a second. If you were listening to this, maybe you remember the anxiety of the 2008 financial crisis, or you felt the recent sting of modern inflation. Now, multiply that panic exponentially.
Oh, it was a completely different stratosphere of panic.
Right. In Germany, the aftermath of World War I brought the punishing reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. This triggered hyperinflation so severe that currency literally became worthless.
Yeah, families were bringing literal wheelbarrows of cash to the bakery just to buy a single loaf of bread.
That is wild to think about.
It is, and that level of daily grinding stress completely strips away a person's faith in standard democratic institutions. People were desperate for any lifeline.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was experiencing the so-called Roaring Twenties. But the text points out that this era of prosperity was actually a super fragile veneer.
Right, it masked incredibly deep racial, religious, and class divisions. Wealth was highly concentrated.
And then, bam, the stock market crash of 1929 hits, ushering in the Great Depression.
So in both nations, you have a terrified, economically devastated public looking at systems that had just completely failed them.
And when the public is devastated, they look to the state for a fix. Both parties responded with massive state intervention to fix the economy, but they did it in fundamentally different ways.
Very different ways.
In the U.S., Franklin D. Roosevelt brings in the New Deal. You have programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration putting millions of people to work.
Which historically was a huge shift.
Yeah.
The text notes this moved the Democratic Party aggressively away from traditional hands-off laissez-faire principles toward building a real social safety net.
But in Germany, the National Socialist Labor Party, or NSLP, took a totally different approach to state intervention.
Yeah, their economic focus was on a concept called autarky.
Autarky, right.
Which basically means absolute national economic self-sufficiency. They initiated massive public works programs, most famously the construction of the Autobahn, to slash unemployment. And they used these fiscal policies to rapidly consolidate their own power.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because if you're a university student looking at this historically, you might think, well, isn't government stepping in to build roads and create jobs during the Depression fundamentally a good thing? Like, where is the danger in an infrastructure project?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the danger isn't in the asphalt, it's in the institutional structure behind it.
Okay, how so?
The NSLP utilized a corporatist model. Imagine if the government didn't just regulate massive corporations like Amazon or Ford, but literally absorbed them, turning every factory floor into a branch of the military.
Wow, so you aren't just an employee anymore.
No, you're a tool of the state. What that meant in practice for working-class families was the complete elimination of independent labor unions. The state crushed socialist elements and co-opted workers into state-sponsored organizations.
So state and corporate interests merged entirely to serve this militaristic, expansionist agenda.
Exactly. You get a paycheck building a road, but you lose your right to organize, your right to strike, and your right to dissent.
But wait, let me push back on the American side of this for a minute. You're painting the New Deal as this broad effort to bring people into the democratic process. But didn't Southern Democrats purposefully engineer those New Deal policies to exclude marginalized groups?
Yes, absolutely.
Like agricultural and domestic workers were deliberately left out of Social Security and labor protections specifically to maintain Jim Crow and keep African Americans disenfranchised. How is that inclusive?
That is a crucial point, and it's exactly what the source text highlights regarding the Democratic Party's internal contradictions. The New Deal was essentially a Faustian bargain.
Right, because FDR needed the votes.
He desperately needed the votes of powerful Southern Democrats to pass his economic relief packages. To get those votes, he compromised on civil rights. The fiscal policies directly benefited white working-class families while systematically harming or just ignoring African-American families.
So the New Deal built a safety net, but it explicitly decided who was allowed to fall into it and who was left to hit the concrete.
Exactly. Economic relief sets the stage, but it's the rhetoric that defines the actors. That brings us to how these parties define national identity.
Because desperation creates a captive audience, but it's the messaging that dictates who belongs in the newly rebuilt nation and who gets left behind.
Right, and both parties position themselves as the ultimate champions of the common people, fighting against perceived elites who supposedly caused the misery.
But the mechanism of populism relies heavily on defining who those common people are, which intrinsically defines who they are not.
Yes, and this is where mass media and propaganda come into play. The NSLP, spearheaded by figures like Joseph Goebbels, weaponized emerging mass media, radio, film, print, to forge a highly exclusionary Aryan national identity.
They didn't just promote their own policies, they explicitly scapegoated Jews, communists, and other minorities.
Right, blaming them entirely for Germany's economic ruin.
Let's think about mass media in the 1930s, not as a megaphone, but as a newly invented funhouse mirror.
Well, I like that.
A funhouse mirror doesn't just amplify what's there, it intentionally distorts reality. It makes the in-group look incredibly large, unified, and powerful, while making the out-group look both terrifyingly dangerous and somehow small enough to crush.
That analogy perfectly captures the psychology of polarization. Because when human beings are under severe economic stress, we are neurologically wired to look for simple answers and clear threats.
And the NSLP's propaganda exploited that wiring.
Completely. Their rhetoric broke inclusivity by demanding racial purity. It was fundamentally about who must be removed for the nation to survive.
Whereas the Democratic Party's rhetoric, primarily through Roosevelt's radio fireside chats, attempted to build a broader coalition.
Yeah, he used the medium to foster a sense of collective responsibility, trying to bring disparate groups under one umbrella.
Even though that umbrella was leaking heavily due to those internal racial factions we just discussed.
Right, exactly. But rhetoric and propaganda don't just stay on the radio or in the movie theater. They materialize into policies that dictate whether families can put food on the table or whether they even have the right to exist.
So how did these differing ideologies actually impact vulnerable groups on a daily basis? Let's look at the lived experiences of these families.
Under the NSLP, we see the systematic progression of exclusionary policies against Jewish communities. And it didn't start with death camps. It started with alienation.
Right. First, Jewish families were blamed for the economic crisis.
Then came economic boycotts of Jewish businesses. This normalized the dehumanization, which allowed the state to pass the Nuremberg Laws of 1935.
And those were the laws that legally stripped Jews of their citizenship.
Right. Yes. And banned marriages between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. Once you legally classify a group of people as non-citizens, the physical violence of Kristallnacht in 1938 becomes institutionally permissible.
Ultimately culminating in the final solution and the Holocaust?
It's the ultimate extreme of exclusionary nationalism. It shows how administrative paperwork literally paves the way for atrocity.
Now, contrasting that with the United States, the daily life struggles for African Americans during this era were profound. Here's where it gets really interesting regarding the text analysis. As we touched on, prior to 1929, the Democratic Party was heavily tied to white supremacy, Jim Crow laws, and segregation in the South.
The party's roots were deeply entangled with institutional racism. But the source material outlines how African-American families didn't just passively accept this exclusion from New Deal prosperity.
No, they utilized incredible survival strategies and grassroots activism.
Because economic dependency on state programs influenced political loyalty, marginalized groups realized they had to force their way to the table.
A prime example is A. Philip Randolph, right, the prominent black labor leader.
Exactly. In 1941, he threatened a massive march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in the military and in the defense industry, which was booming with federal money at the time.
And that threat of terrible political optics basically forced FDR's hand. He issued Executive Order 8802, banning discriminatory employment practices by federal agencies and all unions and companies engaged in war-related work.
And that wasn't a gift from the party elite.
Definitely not.
That was grassroots activism, forcing the institution to reconcile its progressive economic promises with its regressive racial policies.
We also see some really complex navigation by Catholic communities during this era. According to the text, Catholics were largely repulsed by the NSLP's extreme xenophobia, which fundamentally clashed with Catholic social teachings of, universal brotherhood.
Yeah, and in the United States, Catholics faced significant bigotry, too. Just think of Al Smith's 1928 presidential run, which was derailed heavily by anti-Catholic prejudice.
So they leveraged their own faith-based networks. Catholic parishes and local community organizations became these distribution centers for New Deal social justice initiatives.
They threw their voting weight behind the Democratic Party, helping to turn it into a messy, evolving umbrella for working class and marginalized groups trying to survive the Depression.
But the extreme rhetoric and economic strategies of the 1930s made peaceful resolution impossible, didn't they?
They did. You can't build an identity entirely around militaristic expansion and scapegoating without eventually needing a war to sustain it.
So World War II forces a final reckoning for both of these ideologies, testing the long-term stability of their economic and social strategies.
For the NSLP, the war led them to double down on their militaristic exclusionary propaganda. They tied the survival of their regime entirely to global conquest and racial extermination.
Which ultimately led to their complete destruction, leaving a legacy of profound historical trauma and just a shattered nation.
The United States, conversely, emerges from World War II as a global democratic leader. But the war required the mobilization of everyone.
Right. African Americans and women entered the workforce and the military in unprecedented numbers.
And when black veterans returned home after fighting fascism abroad, they absolutely refused to accept systemic oppression at home. The contradictions within the Democratic Party's coalition could no longer be sustained.
But how does an institutional shift like that actually happen on paper? Like, we have a party with deep segregationist roots. How did the actual gears of government turn to dismantle that? It's one thing to have grassroots pressure, but how does the power structure concede?
It happens when maintaining the oppressive status quo becomes a greater political and geopolitical liability than changing it.
The Cold War dynamic.
Exactly. During the Cold War, the United States was trying to win the ideological loyalty of newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. Soviet propaganda constantly highlighted American segregation to undermine U.S. claims of democratic freedom.
So the global pressure, combined with relentless, highly organized civil rights activism like the Montgomery bus boycott and the Selma marches, made segregation totally untenable.
You see President Harry S. Truman taking executive action to desegregate the armed forces. That momentum, fueled entirely by the people, eventually forced President Lyndon B. Johnson to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
The party literally had to abandon its Southern segregationist past to align with global democratic ideals.
Yes, they did.
We've traced this massive historical arc from the economic despair of the 1920s through the transformative crucible of World War II. We've seen how institutions evolved, adapted, and in the case of the NSLP, horrifically failed humanity.
Which brings us right to the present.
Exactly. For the university students analyzing this text, and for you, the modern voter listening right now, how do these historical ideologies still influence modern political discourse?
Well, the text provides very clear historical warning signs that remain highly relevant to current political trends.
Let's go through those.
The first red flag is when economic distress, whether it's inflation, housing shortages, or job displacement, is manipulated by leaders to scapegoat minority populations rather than actually addressing the complex systemic causes.
And the second warning sign.
The second is the blending of corporate and state power in a way that crushes dissent and eliminates independent labor voices.
Right.
And the third is the rise of extreme exclusionary nationalism that defines belonging strictly by who must be kept out.
Those are the warning signs, and honestly, they look chillingly familiar if you pay attention to modern algorithms. The funhouse mirror of the 1930s radio has been replaced by social media feeds.
Yeah, feeds that are literally programmed to reward outrage, amplify in-group purity, and demonize outgroups.
Because that neurological response keeps us scrolling. But the source material doesn't just leave us with red flags, it gives us a roadmap. It outlines 3 actionable ways modern voters can identify and resist harmful political polarization today.
Yes, the first actionable step is absolute vigilance against exclusionary rhetoric. Modern voters must actively identify and reject political messaging that blames complex economic problems on vulnerable groups.
If a politician or a pundit tells you a specific minority or immigrant class is the sole reason you can't pay your bills, history tells us exactly the dark path that rhetoric leads down. You have to recognize the manipulation tactic for what it is.
Step 2. Foster inclusive coalitions. Communities have to prioritize inclusive dialogue over divisive identity politics.
We have to recognize that shared economic and social struggles transcend demographic lines. I mean, wanting good schools, fair wages, and safe neighborhoods are universal desires.
And local communities can foster this by creating civic spaces, whether that's town halls, community boards, or local unions, places where different groups are forced to interact and solve local problems together.
Building umbrellas of shared interest rather than walls of suspicion.
Beautifully put. And the third actionable step is utilizing grassroots activism. Voters must use local organizing to hold political parties accountable.
Just as A. Philip Randolph and civil rights advocates forced the Democratic Party to transform its platform in the mid-20th century, modern voters must demand equity from their institutions today.
Political parties are not static, immovable objects. They are massive structures that bend to organized, sustained pressure.
So what does this all mean? It means that democratic institutions are entirely shaped by the vigilance or the apathy of the people who live within them.
History isn't just a timeline of inevitable events. It's a continuous process of choices, and we are all actively participating in making those choices today. The long-term stability of democracy relies entirely on an informed public, refusing to accept simple, violent answers to complex problems.
I want to thank you for guiding us through this incredibly dense comparison today, tracing how economic despair and populist rhetoric define the 20th century's most extreme political movement is heavy work, but understanding the mechanics of these institutional failures is absolutely vital.
The historical context we explored today is essential for navigating our current political landscape without repeating the most devastating mistakes of the past.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We've talked extensively about the tools of political persuasion, mass media, economic relief programs, appeals to national pride. History shows us that these tools are inherently neutral. The history of the 1930s proves that the exact same tools used to rebuild a broken economy and lift families out of poverty can also be used to systematically dismantle a democracy. So, the next time you turn on the news, scroll through your feed, and listen to modern political discourse, ask yourself, are you hearing an invitation to join a community, or are you hearing a demand to exclude someone else from it? Keep questioning the world around you. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.